The Convergence. The dawn broke cold and clear over the rough country, painting the coulees in shades of amber and rose. James Mackenzie stirred from restless sleep, his body stiff from the hard ground and the tension that had kept him half awake through Samuel's watch. The older man sat with his rifle across his knees, scanning the broken landscape with the patience of someone who'd spent decades reading the prairie's moods. "Quiet night," Samuel said without turning. "But that doesn't mean much out here." James rolled to his feet, wincing at the protest of muscles that had spent too many hours in the saddle. He checked his horse first. The animal was calm, cropping at the sparse grass near the coulee's edge. A good sign. Horses knew when predators were near, whether two-legged or four. "How far to Fort Walsh?" James asked, though he knew the answer. "If we push hard, we could make it by nightfall. But pushing hard means we're not watching our back trail." Samuel finally looked at him, his weathered face thoughtful. "The question is whether Blackwood's behind us or ahead of us." The thought had haunted James through the night. A man like Cornelius Blackwood didn't build his empire without understanding how to outthink his opponents. He might be pursuing them directly, or he might have sent riders on a faster route to cut them off before they reached the fort. "We keep moving," James said. "Whatever happens, that letter has to reach the mounted police." Samuel nodded slowly. "Your wife's a remarkable woman, you know, taking action the way she did." James felt heat rise in his face, part shame, part fierce pride. "I should have been there, should have listened when she tried to tell me about the letters, about her suspicions. Instead, I was so caught up in my own pride." "Pride's a luxury out here," Samuel said, not unkindly. "But so is dwelling on mistakes when there's still work to be done. You're here now. That's what matters." They broke camp quickly, erasing signs of their presence as best they could. The morning air carried the scent of sage and dust, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote's lonely call echoed through the coulees. James checked the leather pouch at his belt for the 100th time, feeling the crinkle of William Garrett's letter through the worn material. 6 years that man had been dead, his murder covered up, his name forgotten. Not anymore. They rode northwest, keeping to the low ground where possible, using the broken terrain for cover. The rough country was a maze of coulees and ridges, carved by ancient rivers and scoured by wind. It was easy to get lost here, easier still to ride into an ambush if you weren't careful. Around mid-morning, Samuel raised a hand suddenly, bringing them to a halt. He cocked his head, listening with the intensity of a hunting wolf. "Riders," he said quietly, "coming from the east, multiple horses, moving fast." James felt his heart hammer against his ribs. "Blackwood? Can't tell yet. Could be anyone. But out here, this far from the trails." Samuel didn't need to finish the thought. Honest travelers stuck to established routes. Men with dark purposes sought the isolation of the rough country. They dismounted quickly, leading their horses into a narrow draw where the banks would hide them from casual observation. Samuel pulled his rifle from its scabbard, and James did the same. The weapons felt heavy in their hands, weighted with the knowledge that they might have to use them. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, echoing strangely through the coulees. James counted at least 4 horses, maybe 5. Too many for just Blackwood and a couple of hired guns. His mind raced through possibilities, each worse than the last. Then a voice carried across the broken land, strong and authoritative. "Mr. Mackenzie, James Mackenzie, this is Sergeant Morrison of the Northwest Mounted Police." James and Samuel exchanged startled glances. "The Mounted Police? How could they possibly—" "We're here to help," the voice continued. "We know about Blackwood. We're looking for you. It could be a trap. Blackwood might have men who could mimic authority, who could use the prestige of the mounted police to draw them into the open." But something in the voice rang true, and James found himself moving before caution could stop him. "Samuel, stay here with the horses," he said quietly. If it goes wrong, I'll be right beside you," Samuel interrupted. "We don't split up now." They climbed the bank of the draw together, rifles ready but not raised in obvious threat. What James saw made him stop in his tracks. 5 riders sat their horses on the ridge above, 3 in the distinctive red serge of the Northwest Mounted Police, and 2 civilians. One of the civilians was young Peter Reed, Daniel Thornton's friend. The other, Eleanor, James's voice cracked on his wife's name. She sat her horse with the same determined grace she brought to everything, her face pale but set with fierce resolve. When she saw him, something broke in her expression. Relief and fear and love all tangled together. "James," she breathed, and then she was sliding from her saddle, half running down the slope toward him. He met her halfway, catching her in his arms, rifle forgotten as he held her tight enough to feel her heartbeat against his chest. She was trembling. Or maybe he was. It was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. "What are you doing here?" he managed. "Thomas is safe with Mary Campbell," Eleanor said quickly. "James, Blackwood is out here. He left Medicine Hat with armed men. He's hunting you." "We know," Sergeant Morrison said, riding down to join them. He was a lean man in his 40s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Young Thornton and Reed reached our patrol yesterday evening. They told us about the evidence you're carrying and the threat to your life." "Daniel's here?" James looked around, suddenly aware of who was missing. "He rode ahead with Constable Williams to scout the trail to Fort Walsh," Morrison explained. "If Blackwood's planning an ambush, that's the most likely place. We need to see this evidence of yours, Mr. Mackenzie." James pulled the leather pouch from his belt with hands that wanted to shake. He'd guarded this letter so carefully, ridden so far to bring it to safety. Now, surrounded by the redcoats of the law, it felt almost anticlimactic to hand it over. Sergeant Morrison read William Garrett's final words in silence, his expression growing harder with each line. When he finished, he carefully refolded the letter and fixed James with a steady gaze. "This is enough to hang Cornelius Blackwood," he said quietly. "Murder, claim jumping, conspiracy to defraud. He'll die for this if we can take him alive to stand trial." "If," Eleanor's voice was sharp. Morrison's expression was grim. "A man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous kind. Blackwood knows what this letter means. He'll fight rather than face the gallows." A rifle shot cracked across the coulees, sharp and unmistakable. It came from the northwest, the direction of Fort Walsh. Morrison's head snapped up and his hand went to his sidearm. "That's Williams's rifle," he said. "I know the sound. Mount up, now!" The next minutes were a chaos of movement. James helped Eleanor onto her horse, then swung into his own saddle. Samuel was already mounted, his face set in hard lines. The mounted police moved with practiced efficiency, rifles out and ready. They rode hard toward the sound of the shot, following Morrison's lead through the maze of coulees. James kept Eleanor in his sight, his heart in his throat every time her horse jumped a washout or scrambled up a steep bank. This was madness. She should be safe at home, not riding toward gunfire in the rough country. But even as the thought formed, he knew the truth. There was no safety anymore, not until Blackwood was stopped. Eleanor understood that. She'd understood it before he had, and she'd made her choice. They crested a ridge and saw the scene below, a narrow canyon where the coulee walls pinched together, creating a natural choke point. Two figures crouched behind rocks on the south side, Daniel Thornton and a mounted police constable, their rifles trained on the canyon mouth. On the north side, partially hidden by an outcrop, James could see movement. Men with rifles, at least 4 of them. And in the middle of the canyon, caught in the crossfire, 2 horses stood riderless, their saddles empty. "Blackwood's men have the canyon blocked," Morrison said, his voice tight. "Williams and Thornton are pinned down. If we go in from this direction, we'll be riding into a shooting gallery." "There's another way," Samuel said suddenly. "A game trail that comes down behind that north outcrop. Used to hunt elk through here years back. It's narrow, but we could come up on them from behind." Morrison studied the terrain, calculating odds and angles. "How many men can that trail take at once?" 2 abreast, maybe. It's tight." "Then we split up." Morrison turned to his constables. "Henderson, you and Reed take the high ground on this ridge. Cover the canyon mouth. If anyone tries to retreat this direction, you stop them. Mrs. Mackenzie, you stay here with them." "No." Eleanor's voice cut through the discussion like a blade. "I'm not staying behind while my husband rides into danger." "Ma'am, this is police business. This is my family's business," Eleanor interrupted. "That man down there is trying to kill my husband because we found evidence of his crimes. I have as much right to see this through as anyone." Morrison looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Eleanor's expression stopped him. James had seen that look before. It was the same determination she'd shown when she descended into the mine shaft, the same steel that had kept her standing when Blackwood's men laid siege to their home. "She can shoot," James said quietly. "Better than most men I know." Morrison's jaw worked, but finally he nodded. "Stay close to your husband. If shooting starts, you take cover and let us handle it. Understood?" Eleanor nodded, and James felt a surge of fear and pride so intense it was almost painful. They'd started this journey alone, isolated by his stubborn independence. Now they would finish it together, surrounded by neighbors and lawmen who'd risked their own safety to help. They left Henderson and Reed on the ridge and followed Samuel down a treacherous path that wound along the coulee's rim. The game trail was as narrow as promised, forcing them to ride single file with the canyon wall on one side and a steep drop on the other. James's horse picked its way carefully, hooves finding purchase on loose shale. Another rifle shot echoed from below, followed by an answering volley. Daniel and the constable were keeping Blackwood's men engaged, but how long could they hold out? How much ammunition did they have? The trail descended sharply, switchbacking down the canyon wall. James could see the north outcrop now, could make out the shapes of men behind it. 4 of them, just as he'd thought. They were focused entirely on the targets to their south, unaware of the approach from above. And then James saw him. Cornelius Blackwood stood slightly apart from his hired guns, his fine clothes dust-covered and disheveled. Even from a distance, James could see the desperation in his posture, the way his hands clenched and unclenched as he watched his men fire into the canyon. Sergeant Morrison raised his hand, bringing the group to a halt. They were perhaps 50 yards above the outcrop now, close enough to hear Blackwood's voice carried on the wind. "Pin them down! I want those 2 dead before." He never finished the sentence. Morrison's voice rang out, amplified by the canyon walls. "Cornelius Blackwood, this is the Northwest Mounted Police. Throw down your weapons and surrender." The effect was instantaneous. Blackwood spun around, his face a mask of shock and rage. His men hesitated, caught between their employer's orders and the authority of the law. For a moment the canyon was frozen in tableau. Lawmen on the trail above, gunmen below, and in the middle, a man whose empire was crumbling around him. Then Blackwood drew his pistol and fired. The bullet spanged off rock near Morrison's head, and the canyon erupted into chaos. Blackwood's men opened fire on the trail, forcing the police and settlers to scramble for cover. James pulled Eleanor from her saddle, dragging her behind a boulder as bullets whined overhead. Samuel was beside them, his rifle already returning fire with methodical precision. From the south side of the canyon, Daniel and Constable Williams added their rifles to the fight, catching Blackwood's men in a crossfire. The hired guns realized their position was untenable. They were surrounded, outgunned, facing the law instead of helpless homesteaders. One of them threw down his rifle and raised his hands. "I'm done. Don't shoot." A second followed suit, then a third. But Blackwood himself kept firing, his face twisted with fury and desperation. He'd built his fortune on fear and violence, and he couldn't accept that it was ending here, in a dusty canyon in the middle of nowhere. "Blackwood!" James found himself shouting, his voice raw. "It's over. The letter's with the police. Everyone knows what you did." For a moment, Blackwood's eyes met his across the canyon. James saw recognition there, and hatred, and the terrible understanding that everything he'd worked for was lost. Then Blackwood turned and ran, scrambling up the north slope toward where the horses were tethered. Sergeant Morrison was already moving, sliding down the trail with reckless speed. James followed without thinking, Eleanor's shout of warning lost in the thunder of his pulse. He couldn't let Blackwood escape, couldn't let this man who'd threatened his family simply ride away into the prairie. Blackwood reached his horse and swung into the saddle, spurring the animal up the slope. Morrison raised his rifle, but the angle was wrong. He'd hit the horse before he hit the rider. James kept running, his own rifle forgotten, driven by something beyond reason. The horse's hooves scrabbled for purchase on the loose shale. It was a good animal, strong and sure-footed, but the slope was steep and the ground treacherous. James saw what was going to happen a heartbeat before it did. The horse's rear legs slipped. The animal tried to recover, but momentum and gravity were against it. Horse and rider went down in a tumbling chaos of dust and screaming horseflesh. Blackwood was thrown clear, rolling down the slope until he fetched up against a boulder with a sickening crack. By the time James reached him, Sergeant Morrison was already there, rifle trained on the fallen man. But there was no need. Blackwood lay crumpled against the rock, his leg bent at an unnatural angle, blood seeping from a gash on his head. His eyes were open but unfocused, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Garrett," Blackwood whispered, so quietly James almost didn't hear. Told him to leave, wouldn't listen. Then his eyes rolled back, and he was still. Morrison knelt beside him, checking for a pulse. After a moment, he looked up at James and shook his head. "He's alive, but barely. Might not make it to Fort Walsh." James stared down at the man who'd haunted his family's nightmares for weeks. Cornelius Blackwood, land speculator and murderer, reduced to broken flesh and failing breath. There should have been satisfaction in it, or triumph, or at least relief. Instead, James felt only a vast emptiness. Eleanor appeared beside him, her hand finding his. She didn't say anything, just stood with him as the mounted police secured Blackwood's surrendered men and tended to their employer's injuries. Daniel Thornton emerged from the south side of the canyon, limping slightly, but alive and whole. Samuel supervised the gathering of weapons with the calm competence of a man who'd seen trouble before and would see it again. The sun was past its zenith now, beginning its long slide toward evening. The rough country stretched around them in all directions, beautiful and harsh and indifferent to human drama. Somewhere to the south, Thomas waited with the neighbors, not knowing if his parents would come home. Somewhere further south, Sarah Mackenzie recovered at the Thornton homestead, unaware that the danger had passed. "Is it over?" Eleanor asked quietly. James pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, dust and sweat, and the faint sweetness of the soap she made from prairie sage. "Yes," he said, "it's over." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't quite true. The immediate danger had passed, but the work of rebuilding remained. They still had debts to pay, crops to save, a mine to claim properly through legal channels. They had neighbors to thank and relationships to mend. They had a family to put back together after weeks of fear and separation. Most of all, they had to learn how to be a family again, not isolated and struggling, but part of a community that had proven its worth in blood and courage. Sergeant Morrison approached, William Garrett's letter still carefully folded in his hand. "Mr. Mackenzie, we'll need formal statements from you and your wife, and we'll need to examine that mine on your property. If what this letter says is true, Blackwood's estate will have significant liabilities. You might find yourselves in a complicated legal situation." "We'll sort it out," James said. The words came easier now, without the weight of pride and stubbornness that had made them so difficult before. "Whatever it takes, we'll sort it out." Morrison nodded approvingly. "I believe you will. In the meantime, let's get everyone back to Medicine Hat. We've got a long ride ahead, and I want Blackwood in a cell before he has a chance to die on us. Man like that deserves to face a judge." They gathered the horses and began the slow journey back toward civilization. James rode beside Eleanor, their stirrups occasionally touching as the trail narrowed. Behind them, Daniel Thornton kept pace with Samuel, the younger man asking quiet questions about the land and the seasons. The mounted police rode with their prisoners in the middle of the column, professional and alert. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, James looked back one last time at the canyon where it had ended. The rough country would keep its secrets, the struggle and fear, the gunfire and blood. The prairie always did. It took what happened on its soil and buried it beneath grass and sage, leaving only bones and stories for those who came after. But some stories needed to be told. William Garrett's story, the Henderson family's story, the story of how a family nearly lost everything because one man's greed knew no bounds, and the story of how they'd survived, not through isolation and pride, but through the help of neighbors who'd become something more. Friends, allies, family. "James," Eleanor's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Yes? When we get home, when Thomas is in bed and the house is quiet, we need to talk about everything." about how we almost lost each other because we were both too stubborn to ask for help. He looked at her. This woman who'd descended into darkness to save their family, who'd ridden toward gunfire to stand beside him, who'd never once given up even when he'd been ready to surrender. "We'll talk," he promised, "about everything, and this time I'll listen." She smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from her in weeks. It transformed her face, washing away the lines of worry and fear, revealing the young woman he'd married a decade ago, the woman he'd nearly forgotten in his obsession with proving himself worthy of the land. "Good," she said simply, "because we have a future to plan, James Mackenzie, and this time we're planning it together." Ahead of them, Medicine Hat's lights began to appear on the horizon, small and distant, but growing brighter with each mile. Behind them, the rough country faded into twilight, taking its secrets and its sorrows back into the earth. And between the darkness and the light, a family rode toward home.